UK general election set for the 4th of July, and this election marks the first July election since 1945. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is said to be facing tough competition from Labour. Nigel Farage has decided not to run. Several headlines regarding this. Welcome, Ian Dunt, columnist, author, podcaster and substacker based in London, UK.
Thank you very much.
So, as I said, this is the first July election since Churchill's Conservatives were defeated in a Labour landslide in 1945. Could you give us some insights on what has said to be the reason for scheduling this general election in July?
A mixture of fear and foolishness, really. So the fear really for Rishi Sunak is what happens to him if he leaves it until winter. In winter, it's really hard to get your volunteers out. This is the weird kind of granular stuff you have to think about if you're winning an election campaign. You've got mostly unpaid volunteers. For the Conservatives, they're quite elderly. They're in their 60s, they're in their 70s. You're going to ask them to go out in the darkness, in the cold, in the rain, in the middle of winter. They're not going to be very interested in doing it. So your preference is always going to be for the summer. The reason that he hadn't decided to do it until this point was because things are going very badly for him. He's 20 points behind in the polls, at least. I mean, some polls put him even worse than that. So he was kind of just waiting and seeing, look, is anything going to come up that can just save me, that can provide me with some sense of hope? And I think at some point, probably last week, he and his closest advisors just thought, nothing's coming. Like the economic improvements are not coming on questions of immigration, on questions of health, on questions of debt. None of these scenarios are improving. So we might as well just go for it now when the weather's still good. And that seems to be the position that he's found himself in.
And what do you think are the potential risks and rewards for the Conservative Party calling a summer election like this?
There are no rewards, really. I mean, they are facing the void, like the complete electoral abyss. So this is a very, very bleak situation for a governing party of the sort that we haven't seen for a very long time. The polling is severe, but it's not just the polling. We had local elections a few weeks ago. And when you started looking at the results in the local elections, not just the headline, but the way that voters were behaving, it would have been very disturbing for Conservatives. Voters were tending to go for any party that was not the Conservative in order to try and damage the government. It didn't matter if it was Labour, it didn't matter if it was the Liberal Democrats. They would basically opt for whoever they thought could inflict the most damage on the government. Now that's basically your nightmare scenario if you're in charge. That's exactly the scenario you don't want to see. The only possible advantage we can find is that there is a competitor party on the right called Reform, which is connected with Nigel Farage. It's quite a hard right party, very, very anti-immigration, very far to the right. It is struggling to sort of fill all of its candidates. It thought that it had a few more months to get all of its candidates in place for all of the 650 different competitions that you have in local areas in the UK for a general election. So the only advantage that I suppose he gets by going now, apart from the weather, is this fact that he can actually just get one under from the Reform Party, try and go for an election before they're fully prepared. Apart from that, I've got to say, there's not a lot of good news around for Rishi Sunak.
And Labour leader Keir Starmer has positioned the upcoming election as a moment for change. Could you tell us what he means by that?
It's been 14 years of Conservative government in the UK. We tend to have governments for a very, very long time. It's been very chaotic. Obviously things like Brexit and COVID, but just a sort of ceaseless churn of ministers. You're going through periods, there was a period where we had 5 education secretaries in the space of 1 year. And that year we had 3 health secretaries. You go through 4 chancellors in the course of a year. It's just this kind of very chaotic sense of ministerial churn, of inadequacy and really structural incompetence at the very height of government. And during that period, public services in this country have basically collapsed. The health service is in a state of perennial crisis. School buildings that threaten to fall in on the children inhabiting them. Just this week, the police put out recommendations saying that they shouldn't, pursue too many arrests because there weren't really any more prison places to put criminals if they were ultimately convicted at the end of it. So you're looking at deep-seated problems with public services, a very chaotic function of government, and 14 years of the same people being in charge. Now, given that that's the context, that's the status quo, it's obviously extremely attractive for an opposition leader to go, what is the message? The messages change. And what you will hear from Keir Starmer over the course of that campaign is just he will say the word change, dozens of times for every 5 minutes that you listen to him. It's change, 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 because at the moment it's what people want, and at the moment it's what he can offer.
And this election being announced, is it hope for people? How divided is the country?
Actually not that bad. When Brexit happened, I think that we all thought that we were suddenly going to become like America. We suddenly thought we would have this deep, brutal, quite vicious divide that would just be with us forever. But actually, it was quite strange. Once the Brexit debate ended, COVID hit, and there was this really quite pent-up desire for kind of unity, really. And that hasn't really gone away. We've now returned to what feels like a much more normal kind of British political conversation. Labour and Tories, sure, but not that sense of culture war. That sense of almost every issue can be traced down to this cultural line between different demographic groups, between liberals and reactionaries and the towns and the cities. So actually, the country really isn't that divided at all. It's also rather helped by the fact that there is an almost universal dislike of the government. I mean, the government is currently on 19% in some polls. It's almost unheard of for the Conservatives to fall below 20%. It doesn't mean that people love Labour. It just means that this is not really about a very divided country at the moment. In fact, if anything, the country is fairly united on the idea of the government are doing very, very badly indeed. Who they want to go and support instead of the government is another matter. But there's a pretty universal consensus on that point.
Thank you, Ian Dunt, for being here today, columnist, author, podcaster, and substacker.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.